Some say that happy people do not become wraiths. Well, that's not entirely true. People who cannot let go become wraiths. Wraiths are the spirit of humans who pass on beyond the shroud separating the world of the living and the dead, yet who are not ready to leave their former lives behind for whatever is planned for them. They are shackled, fettered, if you will, to the Skinlands because of their passions. Unlike the majority of the dead, their souls refuse to accept that their time is gone, and thus they remain as a shadow of their former selves, tied strongly to people and objects and places of their former lives. Regrets are a common fetter, of course, as many people often die leaving things unsaid or undone. Yet it is not simply regret that may tie a soul down to the Skinlands. A powerful love and care for a close one left behind can serve equally well as a passion, as may a burning need for revenge against one's killer, or even pride over a lifetime of labor that one wishes to see the fruits of. These can all serve as powerful passions that fuel a wraith's pathos, their pure emotions, and what allows a wraith to continue to exist, to continue to feel even when their flesh is rotting in the ground. Passions often define us when we are alive, but even more so after our death, for without these passions we will fade away or succumb to oblivion, neither fate especially tempting for the more recently deceased. A famous artist's passions in life may have allowed them to create great works of art, but it may not necessarily be enough to sustain them after death, unless these emotions and drives translate into something which would anchor them to the lands of the living. It is important to make the distinction of passions and fetters even if they are intrinsically connected. A passion is the emotion a wraith attaches to their fetters, their items of obsessions, whether that is unconditional love or vitriolic hate. The fetter, meanwhile, is the object of that emotion and might be a person, an item, or even a place of special importance. The fewer fetters a wraith has, the more at risk they are, for they not only lack a connection with which to anchor their continued existence, but they may lose sight of their goals completely, becoming lost and eventually succumbing to oblivion, becoming specters. Yet at the same time, wraiths cannot transcend, that is to say, pass on to what lies beyond death, until they have resolved their fetters, freed themselves from the shackles of what ties them to the land of the living. This, of course, is the dichotomy, the duality of Wraith. Without fetters, you cannot retain your status quo, but with them, you can never move on or truly be at peace. Fetters are not only anchors in that sense, but they also provide respite and a way for wraiths to heal and recover from damage to their corpus, their ghostly form. This is referred to as slumbering, and through this, the wraith can dissolve their corpus into the safety of their fetter to rest and reshape their spiritual bodies. If a wraith lacks fetters, they also lack the means to heal themselves like this and may fall victims to something called a harrowing. But to understand what a harrowing is, first of all we must understand how the mind of a wraith operates. The idea of the duality of human nature and moral dualism is almost as old as humanity itself. We are inexplicably drawn to the idea of good and evil, of night and day, positive and negative forces. The idea that the human is a creature capable of, even simultaneously, both great evil and great good is never more apparent than to a wraith, however. At the time of their death, the shadow, the darker thoughts and impulses of our mind, separates from the wraith's subconsciousness, which in this setting is called the psyche, and becomes a separate, sentient entity, although while still remaining inside of the mind of the wraith. No one else can see or hear a wraith's shadow, at least directly. It can sometimes claim control over their body, and it will never, ever go away. When a shadow assumes control over a wraith's corpus like this is called catharsis, and while that word's original meaning may carry positive connotations, a wraith waking up from such a scenario will rarely find themselves better off. The shadow is a wraith's death wish made manifest. It has little care for consequences, no love for others, or even itself, and it wishes nothing more than for the wraith to lose their hopes and passions and succumb to oblivion, transforming into a specter. A shadow will tempt the wraith whenever their will is the weakest. It will offer to help, and may in fact even do so, but at a terrible price that may not always appear obvious to the wraith until it is far too late. So when a Wraith suffers enough damage to their corpus, their body, that they are unable to maintain their integrity, they may enter what we call the Harrowing. A Harrowing is essentially an opportunity for the Shadow to design a situation in which they, and sometimes specters called there to aid them, may expose the Wraith to all manners of horrors and trickery in order to weaken their minds, cut their connection to their fetters, and poison their passions. It is often described as a kind of a morality play, with all the odds stacked against the Wraith succeeding. They are subject to situations that may force them into making decisions with lasting consequences, and are designed by the person who knows them the best, the Shadow. The Shadow, after all, is you, and it knows exactly what buttons to push. There are some who say that once upon a time, Harrowings were intended to be a cleansing act, meant to make a Wraith come to accept their situation and thus ease their transition into the afterlife. These Wraiths would have been too frightened to face their own dark selves in the shadows, and thus this would show them that all they had to fear were the lies they were telling themselves. Yet over time, the Harrowings would come to change, and would often lose their educational cleansing purposes, and instead simply become another tool for Oblivion to tighten its hold on those poor souls undergoing their harrowing. The Harrowing takes place in the Labyrinth, the chaotic realm occupying the space between true Oblivion, nothingness, and the Underworld, which is where the Shadowlands, the realm of the Wraiths and the area closest to the Skinlands, the world of the living, is located. The Labyrinth is haunted by specters, and they will gladly construct these nightmare scenarios for any Wraith unlucky enough to be pulled into the Labyrinth by their Shadow. Indeed, the Shadow can even communicate with specters, and it is they together that construct this harrowing. The Underworld is permeated by a massive stormy ocean called the Tempest. This was once known as the Sea of Shadows, yet after the third Great Maelstrom, this sea refuses to ever calm, and thus it was renamed. The Shadowlands are located above the Tempest, and the Labyrinth and Oblivion beneath it. Unless one has the experience, skills, and arcanoi to help them, it is almost impossible to traverse the Tempest safely. Located in the Tempest on the Isle of Sorrows is the great capital city of the Western Undead, Stygia. It is built from the ghosts and memories of every great civilization of Western history that has ever been or ever will be, where the streets of Carthage and New York intersect, and where London and Byzantium intermingle. There is little rhyme or reason to Stygia, but those Wraiths who spend their existence there eventually come to understand its intricacies somewhat. And when a Wraith is first released into the Underworld, they are wrapped in a call and found at the site in the Shadowlands that mirrors where they died in the Skinlands. So the Shadowlands is essentially a reflection of the mortal realm, the Skinlands. Some Wraiths are able to make their way out of these calls on their own, but most are helplessly stuck, wrapped in their own thoughts and dazed impressions, until another Wraith releases them, or they are driven insane by the experience. When they are released from these bonds, they will usually be fairly disoriented, and they are easy pickings for Reapers who make a career out of finding these poor souls and exploiting them, either making them sign contracts forcing them into servitude, or outright selling them to forges where they will be broken down into ectoplasm and reforged into weapons, coins, or even furniture. This is, of course, technically illegal, as there are other Wraiths, so-called drones, who seem to lack any sense of awareness and thus are often allowed to be soul-forged. If an infant, as these newly born Wraiths are called, manages to survive the first part of their new existence, they will eventually earn themselves the title of Lemures, named after troublesome spirits from the Roman times. Lemures stand out in the regard that they still retain fetters, linking them to the Skinlands, and thus allowing them to travel the Shadowlands relatively safely. Their connection to the living world, the Skinlands, acts as a beacon and anchors them to the Shadowlands, the land of the dead. Since the geography of the Shadowland very closely mirrors that of the real world, their connection to the living world, the Skinlands, acts as a beacon and anchors them in turn to the Shadowlands. Since the geography of the Shadowlands is very closely mirroring that of the real world, it is often not hard for these Wraiths to navigate these lands, although certain buildings or objects that held special importance in the hearts of many mortals may still appear as ghostly presences in the Shadowlands. Wraiths may also spot mortals through the shroud that is separating these two lands, and they may even listen in on the conversation, but unless they have the Arcanoi needed to influence the Skinlands, this is the full extent of their connection to it. I pointed out that the Lemures are linked to the Skinlands through their fetters, specifically because there are still wraiths who lack this connection. The Domems are those spirits who no longer have any fetters still in existence. Naturally, one would then assume that these wraiths, the Domems lacking any fetters, would fall prey to their shadows and the Harrowing. But this is why it is important to make the distinction between fetters and passions. For while the fetters may be gone, a Domem may retain their passions, but instead have them relate to the Shadowlands or to Stygia and its inhabitants. Thus they are able to stave off Oblivion, but they are unable to maintain a presence outside of Stygia's protective walls for more than a few minutes, nor are they able to repair their corpus through slumbering. Thus, the Domems tend to be pitied and even looked down upon by other wraiths, as they are generally ill-equipped to deal with the dangers inherent of the Underworld, and will also have a harder, if not impossible time, transcending and moving on beyond this coil. A sufficiently old and experienced wraith may earn the title of Gaunt if they retain their fetters in some form, and are often treated with respect bordering on veneration for their wisdom in all manners related to the world of the dead. And finally, ruling over the legions of the dead are the Death Lords, Charon's Senate, who, since his disappearance, have been competing with each other over who should become the new Imperator of Stygia. These Death Lords are old and powerful, and will often try to meddle with the affairs of the Skinlands to ensure that many mortals die due to causes that will bolster the numbers of their legion. Unbeknownst to the majority of wraiths, however, is that the Death Lords are in fact incapable of directly interacting with the Skinlands, as their fetters are also destroyed, and thus they, despite their powers and status, are Domems. Stygia remains a nexus for the activities of the wraiths of the Western world, and while some prefer spending their time as far away from it as possible, they will inevitably have to involve themselves with the bureaucratic nightmares of the legions, search the immense archives of the Library of Alexandria, or descend the veinous stairs that wind down into the depths of the Labyrinth itself. The three grandchildren of Cain wait patiently for the time of judgment to arise. Bambi Parsons, a leader with an unbreakable will, Procyon, who has been reborn as a god amongst Cain's angels, and Dugal, whose thirst for blood is matched only by his strength of will and purpose. Their childhood, the Methuselah, control our every move through their timeless jihad. They are Maximilian S. Hardcastle, a tutor and master of the jihad, Socrates Johnson, a masterful craftsman of stories, Lauren Eason, a trustworthy ally and friend, and Alexander Kishtaria, esoteric scholar and mentor in magecraft. On the Council of the Primogen are seated Edward Reed, Ian Nichols, Ravenfang, the Autumn Alchemist, and Michelle Light, wise leaders and of good judgment. This week, the Council would wish to thank the Elder Hunter for your continued support. We deeply appreciate your wisdom and belief in our endeavors. We would also wish to give our regards to the Ancile Bucus Wucus, whose service to the Council has not gone unnoticed. Thank you for your support. Naturally, all our elders, Ancile and Neonates receive our gratitude from the bottoms of our hearts. Without your support, this would not be possible. And thank you for watching. Lacrimosa die illa, qua resurge ex favilla, judicantus humureus, huic ergo passe Deus, pie Jesu Domine, donais requiem. Amen.